open borders, shameful abandonment, disregard for human life, the prospect of more mandates and lockdowns, and the list goes on. Now more than ever, we need to stick together. Voting alone is not enough. We must use our dollars to support like-minded companies that fight for our rights and beliefs. Patriot Mobile is America's only Christian conservative wireless provider who shares your values. Last year, we gave more than $500,000 to conservative causes. With your support, we'll give more than $1.5 million this year. It's time to band together and support companies that truly love America and fight for our freedoms. Will you join us?
This is Kentucky's Voice Radio, covering the latest state and local issues with Tom Fallbush, Bob Scott, and Jim Waters.
And welcome, everybody, to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your host for the day, Andrew Cooperrider. I know, guys, settle down. It's very exciting. It's Wednesdays. That means you have Andrew Cooperrider hosting Kentucky's Voice. And right off the bat, we've got a heck of a show scheduled for you today. Pretty shocking video coming out of an Ed Gowron event. Now, I know when I initially play it, you may not find it as shocking as I do, but I'll explain why it's kind of shocking, to say the least. Of course, Ed's running against Thomas Massey there in the Kentucky 4th District. We're not going to really talk about the race per se or talk about the merits, if anything. Just talk about how crazy this video is to someone like me who's been around a lot of campaigns. I've campaigned myself and understand exactly everything that has to go on to create this video. So we'll be talking about that. Also, the Kentucky Supreme Court has made a ruling on the Judge Julie Goodman impeachment coming out of the House. And in the process, they decided to light the state constitution on fire and then scatter the ashes, because apparently it just doesn't exist anymore in their minds. It's kind of hard to figure out exactly where they're going with. Also, the legislature has wrapped up their initial time in office. So it's a 60-day session, but they saved the last 2-3 days for veto override period, and where they pass some other bills that Beshear would agree with, but Beshear has 10 days to veto, so they take 2 weeks off between when they pass a bunch of bills, take 2 weeks off so he can go ahead and veto or whatever he's going to do, and then they can come in and pass it. But a part of that was a one-time spending bill that is pretty shocking, pretty sizable bill. So we've got a lot to cover, of course. Now, if you want to message into the show, our text line is, and hopefully the producer will say it in my ear, 502-571-0970. That's right, 502-571-0970. Sorry, I didn't have it pulled up there because I could be better at my job. But regardless, it is that's our text line. You want to get in your thoughts, your feelings on everything, definitely welcome to do so. If you like what's going on here, you can listen to the Andrew Cooperrider Show right here on WGTK. That's my other once weekly show. That's Sundays at 6. And then also, I believe, if you want to watch, because you're like, I hear Andrew all the time, but what's he look like? Because you want to be disappointed. Well, you can go ahead and do that by watching on WBNA TV. We have new times that it's on. It's on every day at 12:30, 4, and 7. It used to be on at 8. I guess we got moved back to 7. Getting into that. Well, I guess that's farther away from prime time, so I guess that's not something to celebrate. But 12:30, 4, and 7 is the new times for watching there. Also, want to make sure if you want to reach out to me, you can do so. You can shoot over emails to info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. We do have, by the way, another thing I may cover today. We do have a veto. Beshear has vetoed a bill that would ban the use of taxpayer funds for campaigning. Interesting. He would veto that. So we'll go over exactly what he had to say, his veto message, what the bill does too as well. So we'll cover that today. Very excited to be with you, of course, but we're going to start off first with that Ed Gowron video. But coming up on a break, we got about a minute or so break coming up to give you guys some time. But maybe you want to stay tuned in. Remember, the Kentucky Voice text line is 502-571-0970. Kentucky Voice text line. We'll be back in a short minute.
Back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
And you're back on Kentucky's Voice, your host for the day, Andrew Cooperrider. Once again, I want to make sure you have that text line. That is 502-571-0970. Text line. So first I want to start off by sharing with you, this is a video from an Ed Gowron event. This was a public event. He was having a public gathering at the Dairy Queen. A chance for people to come out, meet him, hear him talk. And here's a video from it. I'll explain exactly what happens in it in case you miss it, but it's just a short little 10-second video. Go ahead and play that for me.
You don't want me recording? Why?
So all that to say,
Why can't I
this
record?
symbology is powerful. This is Ed Gowron.
I mean, isn't it my right to record in public?
Last
I
couple
thought
of
so.
things, and I'm going to talk about meeting with the president because I want y'all to hear about that. Where's my veterans in here? Where's my proud veterans? Show of hands. God bless you. Where are we at? God bless you. Okay. Proud to have served. The more I was promoted, the more awards I got, the more humble I became. Why? Because I realized the impact of my actions and decisions on so many, from the battlefield to the bedroom, in terms of them getting...
So what happened there? So he's having this public event. People can turn out. Like, the goal is for people to see the event, attend the event, hear his speech, basically. And there was just a random guy. This wasn't somebody from any particular campaign or anything else that was recording the speech. He was just recording it. Maybe you wanted to share it later to social media. I mean, that's something I do, right? I record speeches and share them to social media. And one of the Gowron campaign workers comes over and tells him to stop recording. This is an event in a Dairy Queen that is supposed to be, the point is for as many people as possible to see it. And he told, hey, we don't want recording. Now we know it's somebody from the Gowron campaign because the campaign ended up reaching out to the guy who recorded the video and apologizing that they ever even asked him to stop recording in the first place. Now, I have worked on many campaigns. I have been the candidate, everything else. Few things you have to understand right off the bat for you to understand why I find this so shocking, and maybe you don't. Maybe you're like, I don't know, it seems like a non-issue. First, whenever you're a candidate and you're speaking, you should always assume somebody's recording, because I've heard some defense of this being, well, he didn't want his words taken out of context. He doesn't want people recording at this event because he's worried it could be used against him or whatever else. That was some of the defenses. That's just not how it works. When you are running for office, you assume everything you're saying is being recorded. That is your assumption. Because it probably is being recorded. Assume everything you're going to say is going to be public. So if you're worried about words being taken out of context, then you just don't say those words. There's a reason why at these events, and you all probably haven't attended many events like I have, but candidates have like a canned speech. They have a set 3-minute speech, a set 5-minute speech, and like a 10-minute speech. And these speeches are generally very well practiced. If you have ever attended many Lincoln Day dinners like I have, like when I was running for state treasurer, and so I attended like probably 60 or 70 Lincoln Day dinners. I don't even know how many, but dinners, events, speeches. And the candidates for all the offices would get up and they would all give the same like 3-minute speech every time. Because you don't want words you're saying to be taken out of context. So you make sure that you tailor make a speech for these types of events that's the case. Now I could understand if you're at, I don't know, a private donor event that you don't want recording. That's pretty like a common assumed thing. I mean, you still shouldn't be saying things you're worried about people hearing about, but that's the case. And in fact, when you're doing a public event like this, the point is and when you're making speeches, the idea behind your speeches and what you're doing should be as many people as possible get to hear it. Should be it gets shared with as many people as possible. You should be encouraging people to record your speech and post it because you want more people to hear what you have to say. You don't run campaigns aren't supposed to be discreet and private. The idea is to reach as many people as possible. So if you're sitting there and you're giving a speech, you should want people to record it. You should want people to post it. That's the entire point. And so you say, well, you know, some guy told him to stop recording at a Dairy Queen, kind of random, but okay. Why is that such a big deal outside of the fact that it makes no sense from the campaigning side of things? Well, to me, as somebody who, as I've said, have been involved in a lot of campaigns, it indicates conversations going on behind the scenes. Campaign workers don't have this kind of initiative. I know you watch TV and you see the suave campaign managers or everything else. Those people work behind the scenes. Keep in mind, a campaign with millions of dollars will be spending millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars will be spent in this race. The campaign managers, the consultants, the people actually like making those decisions and being, the super, forward thinkers and the kinds of people you want initiative from, those people don't go to these Dairy Queen events to help handle the crowd or handle the situation or just to drive the candidate or provide security or whatever else. That they're not doing that, right? So your normal run-of-the-mill campaign worker, which is who's at these events to help manage the event, isn't going to take the initiative to do something like this. The idea behind the entire concept behind a campaign is to have as least amount of possibility of altercations as possible. Campaign workers aren't going to want to confront somebody in front of everybody else unless they've been given a specific instruction. So that means behind the scenes in the Ed Gowron campaign, they're sitting there saying, we need to make sure as few as people as possible see what you have to say. This is obvious by the fact that he's turned down every invite for a debate, every invite for a forum where he's going to be asked questions. Now, Ed will still show up at the dinners and make his canned, 3-minute speeches or everything else. But any kind of like event that might involve you saying something that isn't, that could be, offers the opportunity for ad-libbing, they seem to not want people to see that. Because these types of events where you're at a Dairy Queen, you can be asked questions. You can, sometimes a candidate will start to ad-lib sometimes because they just start feeling themselves and want to talk more. That happens. Okay. But the fact the campaign doesn't want as many people as possible to see that tells me that they've had conversations about this. And that, to me, is a problem. Because one, obviously, if you're running for Congress and you're going to be this closed off during the campaign, when you want to be the most open, how are you going to be when you're in Congress? Now, you don't have to like Massey. I'm not telling you to vote for Massey, and there are other people on that ballot you can vote for too if you don't like Massey and don't like Ed. My point here is just from a sheer campaign analytical side of things. The amount of planning and thought that goes into that interaction is concerning. It points to something going on in the campaign. Now, I've seen defenses of this online because obviously I post online people defending this. Some people have said this is a common refrain is that, well, you know, one, he's worried about things being taken out of context. Well, don't say things that can be taken out of context when you're talking in public. That's like campaigning 101. Two, I've seen people say, well, you know, he's doing the bare minimum to run a campaign because the Trump endorsement is enough. And maybe they're right. I don't know. I know that, I do know this. I know that neither side has released internal polling, which tells me, now, I've heard the internals have Massey like up and about 10 points up. However, there's enough undecided that if it breaks badly, Massey could lose. That's what I've heard, right? But I have heard he is leading from the internals. But the fact that Gowron campaign hasn't released internals says something. Because if you think about it, I mean, we all know Trump loves polling. He loves to point to polling and say, look how well I'm polling here. The polls say I'm doing great. Even sometimes when the polls don't say he's doing great, he'll look at the polls and say they're doing great. The fact that there's no like public polling on this race, there's no internals being released, especially by the Gowron campaign when they know Trump, the main guy who, you know, is pushing this campaign, is so big on polling. That's of some concern there. But also, kind of what he said was kind of interesting there. Didn't he? Said, my decisions affected people from the battlefield to the bedroom. And I kind of think that's a perfect example of what they're a little bit worried about, because that is kind of an odd thing to say. Like, you'd say from the bedroom to the table, from the bedroom to, you know, the household, or not bedroom, sorry, from the battlefield to the household. But I understand the alliteration of bedroom sounds great. But saying, you know, the decisions I make really affect the bedroom is definitely an interesting take. So that's enough of talking about national politics. When we come back, we'll be talking about state politics, my expertise, the place I like to talk about the most. We'll have that here when we get back in just a few short.
Now, back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
And welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I had a couple texts come in I do want to respond to. If you want to voice your opinion, you can go ahead and text in the Kentucky Voice text line at 502-571-0970. First question is, will we have a budget surplus? So obviously the legislature has passed a budget. This year will probably go through line item veto certain things, and then they will overcome his vetoes, and that will pass. Now, you asked about a budget surplus, right? So one is a revenue surplus, means we brought in more revenue than we expected, and so we were able to put that to the side. A budget surplus is a little bit different, as in we budgeted to bring in this amount of money, and then we ended up bringing in more than that. Okay, so revenue surplus is expected basically, and a budget surplus is they budgeted for this amount to be brought in, but really we brought in more. We probably will every year. The amount that they've budgeted us to bring in taxes has been less than what we actually brought in, so we probably will. Do have another text here too. Andrew, what's more likely? 1, a Kentuckian who unabashedly says no to importing new Kentuckians. 2, a balanced budget and no state property taxes passing. Or 3, Andy's office financial transactions being put publicly before the presidential run. So let's talk about all this here. So 1, a Kentuckian who unabashedly says no to importing new Kentuckians. The key word was says, not does, in that phrase. So as far as a Kentuckian who unabashedly says no to importing new Kentuckians, sure, absolutely. Nate Morris right now is regularly saying, like, no to bringing in any more people, no immigration at all until we get rid of all the illegal immigrants coming in here. The problem with the word says compared to doing is a lot of times what politicians say and then what their actual actions are don't always compute. So chances of having somebody who says it, 100%, we have one right now. Chances we have somebody who actually ends up doing it and holds fast to it and never gives it up and doesn't make a deal on it with somebody, I would say next to 0. Number 2 was a balanced budget and no state property taxes passing. Now, when you talk about a balanced budget, I think this is really key. So in the state of Kentucky, we have a constitutional amendment that says we have to have a balanced budget. All that means is we're not spending more money on our governmental functions, on the functions of the government, than we are bringing in. However, I think it's important to notate that by saying that we still, though, issue bonds for capital projects. So while we have to have a balanced budget, it has been interpreted that, well, but if we really want to build something new and shiny and fancy, we can issue bonds to go ahead and do that, and that is okay to do. So we can go into debt for, like, building things, but we can't go into debt for the operation of the government. So when you're asking about a balanced budget, it depends on what you're defining it as, because there's what they define it as, and then there's what, normal people would define a balanced budget as, which is not, period, across the board, spending more money than you bring in. And if that's it, the chances of that occurring, I think, are next to 0, considering that, when you look at the Budget Reserve Trust Fund and they sweep over like $1 billion or $2 billion, let's say a year into that, you're like, wow, yeah, that's surplus, $1 billion or $2 billion into the trust fund. Those are good deposits, except for the fact that, in this budget that they just passed, we're pulling out $4 billion a year in bonds every year, total of $8 billion over the 2 years. $4 billion in bonds. That is more bonds being authorized just at the state level than we are having in extra money that we're putting to the side. So is the budget really balanced if you look at it the way we do? No. And the chances of it happening, 0. Absolutely 0. And then no state property taxes passing, that's like never going to pass. I don't see that ever happening here in Kentucky. Wish it would, but I don't see it happening. Or 3, Andy's office financial transactions being put publicly before the presidential run. Well, 0. So we have 1, 2, and 3. Since 1 is says and not does, 1 is most likely is currently occurring. The other 2, as structured and as you probably understand it, will never happen. But moving on from that, I do want to touch upon, speaking of Andy Beshear, this veto he did on this bill. Very fascinating veto in my humblest of opinions. So this veto was on, let's see here, Senate Bill 3059. Senate Bill 59. So what it does is it's already illegal for schools, for an example, to use taxpayer funds to advocate for or against a ballot initiative. What that means is using taxpayer funds to, campaign, right? So we saw this especially during the school choice fight, where you had public schools using their social medias, using their email lists that they have for all the students, using their employees, emails to their employees to advocate against the school choice amendment there about a year or so ago when that fight was going on in 2024. And so they were spending that money. They're not supposed to be, but there was never any punishment attached to it. So what Senate Bill 59 does is it prescribes a punishment, basically stating it's illegal, you'll be charged with a crime, you're also not allowed to hold a position within government for, I think it's 10 years if you violate this, if you use taxpayer funds to essentially propagandize the Kentucky taxpayer to vote one way or another on an issue. You can't take my money to then campaign to me to vote to give you more money. Like, you're not allowed to do that. And so they passed this bill, and Beshear, of course, vetoed it. Reading now from his veto message. As written, Senate Bill 59 is far too broad and violates the First Amendment. It would prohibit members of the General Assembly from speaking from their annexed offices or on state or public property about constitutional amendments set to appear on the ballot. Many state legislators used these and other state resources in 2022 when Kentucky voters defended Amendment 2, and again in 2024 when voters in all 120 counties rejected a change to the Kentucky Constitution that would have allowed public dollars to flow to private schools. We should be protecting the First Amendment and not restricting it. That's his veto message. So keep in mind who passed this, the General Assembly. So even if it can be construed to mean what he's trying to say, saying that members of the General Assembly wouldn't be allowed to basically speak from their offices or their annex offices or anything else, state or public property, about constitutional amendments set to appear on the ballot. Even if that is the rule and it really is pushed that way, 1, they're okay with it. 2, I'm kind of for it. Why should they get to use taxpayer resources to campaign for a ballot initiative? Why should they get to use taxpayer resources to try to pass a constitutional amendment, Andy? And he's saying, it restricts First Amendment because you can't take somebody else's money and spend it to amplify your message. Money that was taken from us by force. Money that was stolen from us to begin with. And now is being used to, of course, push, to try to propagandize and push us towards a certain direction. I don't care if you're a teacher. I don't care if you're a superintendent. I don't care if you're a legislator. I don't care if you're the governor of the state. You shouldn't be allowed to use taxpayer resources and taxpayer funding to try to convince me to vote a certain way. Call me crazy. But, that just seems fair. And if they're willing to pass that control on themselves, if it even means that, though I think he's overreading it, because, of course, he doesn't want to come out and just say, well, I just like the schools to campaign, because that's easier than having to go out and convince people to give us money to then put forward our message on our own dime. It's easier just to take it from the taxpayer. Well, when we get back, talking about this Supreme Court ruling on Judge Julie Goodman impeachment, how ridiculous it is, and how, frankly, it just shreds the Constitution. We'll be discussing that when we get back here. If you want to get in your text, it's 502-571-0970. We'll be back in a few short minutes.
to Kentucky's Voice Radio online at kyvoice.org.
And you're back on Kentucky's Voice. Got a few texts going to respond to before I move on to our next segment, this Judge Julie Goodman impeachment. If you want to get in your text, it's 502-571-0970. I believe that's the number. 502-571-0970. Text came in and says, Andrew, you're an exceptional speaker. Thank you for the compliment. Raging on Gowron for 15 minutes was not you at your best. All speakers say dumb things. Trump dropped an F-bomb last weekend. Yeah, I know. All speakers say dumb things, and that's all part of it. Also, I know it's probably not my best, and I'm going to be honest with you. I don't really... I follow national politics probably as much as any of you. You know, I get a variety of sources as far as it goes. I'm one of those rare birds that listens to both Mark Levin and Tucker Carlson. I listen to both Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro. It's always fascinating to me, too, because they talk about each other all the time. And they'll play clips from each other's shows. And, I've seen that full show. So it's kind of interesting to do so. So I am, I guess, educated per se on that side of things. And that's what I listen to for entertainment at times. But when it comes to where my area of expertise is, it's on state politics. To be quite honest, I don't care as much about a lot of these seats because it just seems to not really matter. A lot of what we're talking about, and I know I'm just riffing now, but a lot of what, one of the big things. So I see these campaigns running both Senate and Congress and everything else, and they're talking about Trump. Talking about, I'm going to be Trump's number one advocate. I'm for Trump 100%. Trump has 2 years left. He can't run again. And most likely the Democrats will take the House. Hope they don't, but it seems more and more like they will. So Democrats take the House. Trump won't be able to pass any legislation through Congress over those 2 years anyways. And then he's out of office. And at least in the Senate race, you have them for 4 more years. And Congress, well, typically they stay in for longer than one term as well. So I start to wonder, what are you without Trump? Who are you going to be when Trump's not in office? What are you going to do when you don't have somebody like Trump to tell you what to do or how to vote? We've seen the same Congress people falling in line with Trump vote in ways that completely go against Trump's policies. Obviously, that's why we have some of them in the first place. So I do wonder that, but also at the same time, when it comes to congressional seats, listen, they're 1/435th of 1/2 of 1/3 of our federal government. I do care more about state politics because that's where most of the policies that I can affect on taxation come from. Most of the policies and laws that affect us come from. A lot of our spending that we can actually have more, get a handle on and be able to hold people accountable to comes from there. And also the races. You've got a bad, if you have a bad House rep in Kentucky, and you're trying to primary them, all of 2,000 to 3,000 people vote in that race. You can run a competitive campaign in that circle with $50K. If a couple people go out and door knock a couple weekends for 2 months, they can flip that race. When you're talking about Congress, you're talking about a voting block. There's 750,000-ish, I believe, people in a congressional district right around there. There's probably, I imagine, 50, 60, 70, 100,000 people that vote in those primaries. These are races that cost millions of dollars. And that money has to come from somewhere. And those people are the people really calling the shots in a lot of those situations. And just specifically, it's just something I feel powerless to change a lot of times. And so I don't focus on it. But I do focus on state politics because, one, I can make a difference. Two, I feel they have way more control over our lives. What we interact with every day, roads, bridges, your tax rates, your property taxes, your how expensive your housing is a lot of times set by local and state governments based upon their housing policies. All those things are being handed down from the state. Even when it comes to illegal immigration, states can do a lot to make it as uninhabitable for an illegal immigrant as possible. Whether that's working with ICE, whether that's not offering in-state tuition rates to illegal immigrants, whether that's a variety of different options. But regardless, I understand. When I'm talking about federal stuff, it's not the best. And also, what I was talking about in the Gowron thing was more about the campaign side of things. Not as much about him or Massey or anything else. Different conversation for a different day, maybe. I don't know. But regardless, another text came in. Semantics and definitions matter. You always educate me to improve my questions and thoughts. Thanks. Thanks for that. He also said 10 generations of Kentucky blood, and I'm incentivized to move to Tennessee or Indiana because they are making the better decisions. Yeah, Kentucky always seems to lag behind in a lot of things when it comes to our taxation policy, especially in places like Florida and Texas, getting rid of property taxes, getting rid of income taxes, Tennessee getting rid of income tax, and Kentucky's coming along slowly but surely, and then is like, yeah, but if we drop the income tax, well, we'll bring in a bunch more people will come to the state, and so that'll expand our tax base. The problem with that is there's all these other states currently offering that. And so maybe you missed the boat a bit. It was a little bit, I don't know, a little bit of what I have to say. But, well, moving on from the text, if you want to get in your text, 502-571-0970. So I want to talk about this Judge Julie Goodman impeachment. Now, in case you're unaware, this is a judge out of Lexington who, for the first time in over a century, got impeached by the House. But the state Supreme Court has stepped in and decided to go ahead and get involved in it. And she's got a lot of claims in there. There's a few things she did that's improper, some of them on pending cases and everything else. But essentially, the two things I want you to focus on is, one, she went outside of the courtroom to research a case on her own, which is like not allowed. Not allowed. Okay? But here's a big one. So somebody was found guilty of a crime. And of course, some drug crimes or crimes. And the state has a law saying this is the minimum sentencing for this crime. And she sentenced the person to a sentence lower than the state minimum. So the legislature passes a law. The judge then decides to not follow that law that they passed. So what do? Well, they impeach her. That's what you should do. That is the legislature's check. Despite that, the Kentucky Supreme Court has ruled that the impeachment cannot continue. And this creates a really big constitutional crisis. Because, one, they're ignoring a large part of the Constitution. They're literally the same section. We'll talk about this, but I'll go through the constitutional sections with you here when we get back. We're coming up on a break here in about 45 seconds or so. So I want to make sure I continue this. But they ignore large parts of the Constitution, only read certain, don't even continue on the sentences. And then the also crisis here is what happens if they continue with the impeachment? That leads to some questions too as well. So we'll be discussing all that when we get back here. If you want to text into the show, once again, Kentucky Voice text line 502-571-0970. Apparently I have 2 minutes left. I'm sorry. I thought it was a 10-minute segment. It's a 12-minute segment, 13-minute segment. So we will have a chance to go into it. I apologize, everybody. Just absolutely falling apart today. I apologize. So we go over Judge Julie Goodman, what's going on there. And so the Kentucky Supreme Court rules that a few things, but they ruled that it is in their purview to go ahead and handle any kind of punishment of judges, that is their sole responsibility, and that it somehow violates the separation of powers and the Constitution if the legislature goes ahead and comes in and impeaches her for not following their sentencing guidelines. So I want to read to you two parts of the Kentucky Constitution. Here's first section 66. This is all it says. The House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment. The House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment. So that means that obviously it's not to fall to the courts. It is solely, impeachments are solely within the House of Representatives. Now, and then it says all impeachment shall be tried, it's section 67, shall be tried by the Senate when sitting for that purpose. The senator shall be upon oath or affirmation. Now let's go to a very specific section that's talking about the courts, which is section 109 of the Kentucky Constitution. The section that literally sets up how our courts are set up. So here it goes. The judicial power of the Commonwealth shall be vested exclusively in one court of justice, which shall be divided into a Supreme Court, a Court of Appeals, a trial court of general jurisdiction known as the Circuit Court, and a trial court of limited jurisdiction known as the District Court. The courts shall constitute a unified judicial system for operation and administration. The impeachment powers of the General Assembly shall remain invalid. Meaning, you can, just because it literally is saying that just because you have this court system that the Supreme Court's over, the House of Representatives, the legislature can still impeach. That is still in their purview. So we'll talk a little bit more about their ruling and how they're taking section 109, reading half of it, then ignoring the rest of it, and lighting the entire Constitution on fire and creating what can be quite a constitutional crisis. If you want to text in while we're at it, 502-571-0970. Once again, 502-571-0970. We'll be back here in just a few short minutes.
Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
And back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your host for the day, Andrew Cooperrider, talking about the Supreme Court stepping in to say the impeachment of Julie Goodman cannot continue because they say so, despite what the Constitution says. We'll be discussing that. Also, I've got a few texts that have come in. We'll cover those after I finish my point here. The text line, though, for those of you who want it, 502-571-0970. So the Supreme Court steps in and says, look, if you want to punish a judge, it has to go through us. Because we have a system, we've got a process, and you're violating the separation of powers and co-equal branches by going ahead and, impeaching a judge. Basically, you just can't do it. And this is frankly ridiculous. First off, as I laid out, they do have their own, in the Constitution, they're laid out to have their own ability and powers for them to oversee the Supreme Court. But it still says in that same section, Section 109, it says literally that the legislature still has the power of impeachment and that cannot be violated. That goes to them. And once again, looking at what happened here, Judge Goodman sentenced somebody for a crime that by law required a minimum sentence, and she ignored it. This isn't a slap on the wrist. You didn't follow the law. And the only power the legislature has to ensure the other branches follow what they have to say is impeachment. And frankly, it concerns me to see the judicial say something about co-equal branches when the Jeffersonian process doesn't have co-equal branches. This idea of co-equal, separate but equal branches or whatever else, that's not true. The legislature always has had more power than the other two branches. They can defund them. They can impeach. In the state of Kentucky, the legislature can impeach anybody they want to other than another legislator. They can also defund any state department they want to. Period. So please tell me, the person who decides how much you get paid, if you get paid, and can fire you, do they have more power than the other two branches do that can't do any of that? Of course, they have more power. And they're supposed to, because they're the largest branch of elected people. As Jefferson said, the branch closest to the people, the legislature. They're voted on by they have, in the state of Kentucky, 138 elected people make up the legislature. 138. That is like 1,000% more than the other branch. I don't even know what that percentage is, but it's, it's a handfuls at the top of the other two. You can count them. Over in the legislature, 138. Of course, they have more power. So they said, hey, I'm gonna ignore that. But the problem here with their ruling is, so they rule the impeachment can't continue. What do they do if the legislature does continue? Are they going to try to hold the entire legislature in contempt? And what happens now that they've just ignored the Constitution if the legislature comes in and says, we're going to impeach all the justices? Do they get to decide now what makes a mistake? See, here's the thing. It's always been up to the legislature to decide what makes up an impeachable offense. Of course it is. Think about this critically. If the courts are left up to decide for the legislature who and what they're allowed to impeach over and not, and if that's up for interpretation beyond within the legislature itself, those 138 members, if the courts get to decide that's not impeachable, that is, That's not impeachable. That is. What happens when you try to impeach a Supreme Court justice? Or all of them for ignoring the Constitution? Do they get to now rule on their own impeachment? This is the clearest part of our... This is like next level clearest. It is said many a times about the legislature and its impeachment powers. This is... I cannot overstate. This is a big issue. Big issue. So going now to the text here. Someone said the KY legislature should ignore the Supreme Court, impeach the judge, trial, and remove her. Otherwise, where do we go? I don't know. That's why this is the concept. This is where it goes. This is what I could see happening. I could see the legislature either, one, forcing them to hold them all in contempt, which honestly would be next level. I mean, I would clap. That would be so exciting. Wouldn't it be exciting? I mean, this is never heard of before in this country, that the state Supreme Court holds all 138 legislature of the House in contempt, or at least everybody who votes yes on impeachment. Or, you know, I guess it'd be maybe just the Senate you could hold, but the House has to try it. Because they also claim, well, she wasn't afforded her due process. The due process is the House decides whether or not to impeach her, then that case is held in the Senate. That's where the due process takes place. That's where the trial over impeachment takes place, is in the Senate. That is the due process. So one, that would be next level. Two, what they could do, if they really want to get fancy with it and really create a real crisis, this would be next level to me. Like, this would be, honestly, I don't even know how excited I'd be if this happened. They wait for the governor, Bashir, to be out of office. Republican governor comes in. They then impeach the Supreme Court justices for ignoring the Constitution. The Supreme Court tries to say, no, you can't impeach us, tries to hold them all in contempt. But the courts have no way to enforce their ruling without the executive branch being willing to enforce it. So the Republican governor says, well, they made their ruling, let's see them and try to enforce it. Then the legislature goes ahead and impeaches them all. And then the governor orders KSP to go in and arrest the judges and pull them out of office if they refuse to leave. That is, while that would be a crazy outcome, that's kind of an outcome that's been set up here. It isn't beyond the realm of possibility something like that may happen. Like I said, the fact, if you don't know anything about this case and you haven't heard it explained to you like this before, no, people aren't realizing the significance of this case. The significance of them coming in and doing what they did. Here's another one here. Someone asked, Metro Louisville is removing party affiliation on the upcoming ballot. What say you? So, you know, this is an interesting question. When it comes to whether or not party affiliation should be in place, I used to think when I was a younger boy, just a small man, before I ran for office, before I had ever knocked doors in a general election, I mean, I've knocked thousands of doors for campaigns. Before I did that, I would have said, get rid of party affiliation. Get rid of it. Let them vote. They should be voting on people based upon their ideas. Then I knocked doors in an election. And I realized, one, how uninformed the people who actually show up and vote are. Two, also when you knock doors in a general election, partisan or not, one of the first questions they all want to ask is, well, what party do they belong to? What party are they with? And so, considering that voters want to know that to even make their decisions in the first place, I tend now to say, let's put all party affiliations on the ballot. Let's just put it up there. Because the voters just don't, they're just not informed enough, especially in local elections, to know who to vote for. And at least they have some idea, well, if I identify as a Republican and this person's a Republican, they at least somewhat share my values versus somebody who's a Democrat. You can say, well, they don't share my value. It helps you figure out who shares the values with you, because I would love for every person who votes to go out and research and listen and pay attention and do all those things. But they're not going to do that. We know that. They're not going to. So party affiliation becomes the next closest thing we can get to instant information, the best we can get. And if you're ashamed of the party you're in, why are you in it? Either you believe in what they have to say or not. Someone else asks, who's going to challenge the KY Supreme Court? How do we remove Supreme Court judges? They have to get impeached by the legislature, which once again, if they're allowed to rule on their own impeachments, how do you impeach a judge? Someone said judges should not rule on impeachments and removals. Legislature, perhaps the KY Supreme Court should, perhaps the legislature should, I think they're saying the legislature should get rid of the Kentucky Supreme Court's office space and budgets reduced till they comply. That's a good option too. Defund them. They'd probably end up creating some ruling saying you have to fund constitutionally, you have to give us money and you have to give us this amount. Constitutional. Because they're so out of control. They said, have the state district attorney file charges and state police arrest the impeached judge for violating sentencing guidelines. Well, here's the problem with that. Is that one, it has to be within the jurisdiction. In this case, she's in Lexington. Now, the prosecutor, on the other hand, in Lexington doesn't like this judge, so that could happen. But the claim would still be from the courts that if you want to punish a judge for decisions made on the bench, which is what they just said, you have to do it through us. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for. Sorry if I didn't get to your messages, but it's an important topic. If you want to hear about the budget bill, the one-time spending bill, I'm going to be talking about that on my other weekly show. You can tune in here on WGTK Sundays at 6, or head over to theandrewshow.com. Check out where to listen to that. Until next time, I'll be seeing you.